friends, to another edition of Economic Update, a weekly program devoted to the economic dimensions of our lives: jobs, incomes, debts, those for our children, and those looming down the road facing us. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. I've been a professor of economics all my adult life, and I'm trying to use that history to bring this program to you in a way that keeps you up to date about what's happening in the economy we live in and depend on. Let me jump right in by telling you a story about the New York Times and its receipt of a leaked document. This happens a lot when government officials, upset by what their own government is doing, decide it's time for the public to know, and they find a friendly reporter and give him or her the documents in question so that we all get to see and hear what's going on. And what happened recently was that an agency inside the Trump government was commissioned to look at the costs and benefits of letting refugees and immigrants into the United States over the last 10 years. The report shows crystal clearly that these folks over the last 10 years contributed $63 billion, they even came up with a number like that, more in the productivity of their labor, in the taxes they paid, and so on, than they cost the United States. So they were clearly a net economic gain. This, of course, is not the message the Trump administration wishes to propose. So immediately they denounced the leak rather than dealing with the substance of the issue. And in particular, a close advisor to Mr. Trump, one Stephen Miller, went so far as to offer alternative facts, reminding me that while statistics don't lie, statisticians can and do. Here we go. What did Mr. Miller propose? He said we should be looking at the difference in costs to the American economy of new immigrants, refugees, on the one hand, and Native Americans who aren't immigrants but just live here and work here on the other hand. This is silly. Always refugees and immigrants, in the first 2 or 3 or 4 years that they're here, cost all kinds of things because that's the time it takes to adjust to a new language, a new culture, a new home, a new region, a new job, and all the rest. So the appropriate comparison isn't the first 3 or 4 years of an immigrant or a refugee, but it's a question of a long-term situation in which, yes, there are costs in the beginning, as with all investments, and then payoffs over time, as with all investments. But, if you want to make a point and you don't want to be too careful about how you support it, you do what Mr. Miller and the Trump administration have done when you're embarrassed by a document that shows that indeed letting folks into the country, which the United States has done from its earliest days, is a long-term economic payoff. But I want to add a few points because this issue of immigration does not go away. Mr. Trump is determined to use it as a scapegoat issue, a distraction, to face a hard reality. He cannot afford to tax wealthy people and corporations because they are the only financial support he and his candidacy and his presidency have. So he needs to pander to them. He cannot raise the taxes on corporations and the rich, despite the fact that they have done the best over the last 40 years compared with the 99% of the rest of us. So if he isn't going to do something about that, having run on the presumption that he might, scapegoats are useful, and immigrants is a way to focus people on issues that take them away. But that has costs. I'm not talking about the moral or the political costs. It is, after all, bizarre in the world we live in today to have a country, the United States, bombing 6 or 7 other countries, but not be willing to take the refugees who run away from the bombing and feel some obligation in this situation. It's rather odd, but I'm not going to talk about that. What I want to talk about are the economics of it, and there are several. Millions of people coming in here creates a demand for housing, for schooling, for goods and services that boost an economy. We're losing that if we get rid of these people. That has to be faced. And there are many other costs. If I had more time, I would go into them. A recent report indicates that California's agriculture is seriously impacted by a shortage of labor. They can't get the people to harvest the vegetables. They can't get the people to do the hard work. And here comes something that should surprise nobody. Americans are not, Native Americans I'm talking about, are not that eager to have jobs that pay as poorly as those agricultural jobs do. And we're facing higher food prices, we're facing higher food imports, which may make this country dependent on food. We have all kinds of consequences that are not being taken into account because it's politically expedient to make immigrants a scapegoat. I want to turn next to the issue of the BRICS countries, B-R-I-C-S. If you're not familiar, let me tell you what that stands for. B is for Brazil, R is for Russia, I is for India, C is for China, and S is for South Africa. These 5 countries are now kind of middle economically developing countries. They're not quite as rich yet as North America, Western Europe, and Japan, but they're rapidly catching up and in some cases overtaking those parts of the world. They are a very important block of nations, and they have all kinds of agreements amongst themselves, and they're welding all kinds of diplomatic relationships. I want to put into context how important they've become and then tell you why it matters. So I'm going to compare over the last 20 years. So I'm comparing 1997 with 2017. That's a 20-year gap. And I want to talk about the share of global output of goods and services that were achieved by the United States in 1997 compared to what the contribution was of all 5 of the BRICS nations. In 1997, the United States accounted for 23% of world output of goods and services, and the BRICS altogether 15.4%. So the United States alone was a much bigger player in the world economy in 1997 than all 5 of the BRICS countries. What has happened in the 20 years to 2017? The United States' share of the world economy, 18.2%. It's dropped 3 percentage points from what it was 20 years ago. And the BRICS, they are now 30.4%. Those 5 countries doubled their importance in the world economy. Well, here's why it matters. Sooner or later, the bigger the chunk of the world economy you account for, the bigger your footprint on what happens in the world, the bigger your influence, the bigger your power. The power of the United States is shrinking, and the power of alternatives, alternative countries, alternative blocks of countries, and above all of the BRICS, is zooming. Now, most of that is accounted for by China, but nonetheless, it is something that binds those 5 countries together, and it tells you something about how the world is changing. After all, 300 years ago, when capitalism took off in England, Western Europe, North America, and so on, those parts of the world which were relatively minor players in world history became the dominant players. The British Empire, the American Empire, and so on. And that's when their share of global output mushroomed. Now that their share is shrinking and that of other players is what's mushrooming, then the future looks like it belongs to them. And that puts into a very scary context, but my job is not to make believe. For that you can watch other programs, but to make it harsh and clear. It is therefore interesting that the United States is busy around the world militarily, and makes one wonder, are we flashing our military power and predominance because the economic foundation isn't there for it anymore? Something to think about when we confront military adventures abroad. My next update is a very little story, but in a way a monstrous one. It has to do with the closing or the privatization, we have both of them, of public libraries in cities and towns across the United States. It is becoming a scary comment. It's another kind of shrinking of your economic footprint when you don't have the resources, or to be more accurate, you don't make available the resources so that every city and town has what for 100 years we've prided ourselves having, a place where young people and old people can go and get books and tapes and avail themselves of the cultural products of this society in a free public library. What's happening is the following. Cities and towns are strapped for money. That goes back to what I said before. Unwillingness politically to tax the wealth where it is and to tax the high incomes where they are. Now that we have one of the most unequal economic systems in the world today, we can't seem to get the tax support from those who have it most, those from whom, if it were taken, would affect their lives the least. So we have to cut back because we don't tax. And one place we seem to think it's appropriate is the public library. So recently, what came to my mind was Escondido, California, little town. I read in the San Diego Union Tribune back in August the struggle of that village and town to hold on to its public library. There had been an effort to shift it to a private company, quite notorious, called Library Systems and Services, LS&S, sometimes called LSSI. It now runs about 80 public libraries across the United States, where it has succeeded by going into the town and saying, well, you don't want to spend money on your public library because you don't have the money, you don't have the taxes, you're unwilling or unable to go get the taxes from the people who could give it to you. So here's what you do. Let us run the library. You won't have to pay for it, and we'll run it, and we will make a profit off of it because we're so terribly efficient. Well, this is the old story of what we call privatization, this endless effort of private companies to make money by taking over what the community, what the public authorities have been doing for us, often quite nicely, thank you, for 100+ years, as, for example, public libraries. It turns out, and there's lots of information about this, particularly, again, the New York Times has been very useful in revealing this. There have been stories in the Huffington Post and elsewhere. What they do is they get rid of unionized employees and hire non-union employees, paying them much less. They're not accountable to the community because it's now a private enterprise that runs the library. The hours get cut, the services get reduced, making money, profit, the bottom line, and all the rest of it. And the hope is nothing happens because the town leaders are so happy they don't have to pay for public libraries. It's a movement that's happening across the country. It takes such extremes that in San Juan, Texas, the community did it, and then after a few years undid it and found it was better off staying with the public library than with the private one. It's an extraordinary comment. It's a kind of fundamentalism in economics to believe that doing something with private enterprise is always and necessarily more efficient than doing it with public enterprise. There's absolutely no evidence from the economics profession which studies this question that that's true. For every example, and there are, where a private enterprise has done something more efficiently than a public one, there's a counterexample of the reverse. And there you are, you're stuck with it. Turns out it's probably a better idea to wonder and look at whether any particular activity that a community wants is better handled in a public way or a private way. There are good reasons why we don't have anything other than a public fire department and public schools. Well, we used to have public schools. Madame DeVos is trying to undo that, but doesn't look like she's going to make it. We have all kinds of public services. Our parks, our army, our police. It's very interesting. We've decided to do it. but we seem to need to give lip service to the idea that the private is somehow better. Every day the newspapers are full of what private entrepreneurs have done. And they've done a lot of criminal activity, a lot of stealing, a lot of misrepresentation. Let's remember all the things we've read in the last 12 months about car companies and banks and all the rest of it. To think that a private enterprise is the way to go always, and that is a kind of unthinking promotion of the private sector. I don't mind you promoting it, but don't pretend that there's much else that's going on. Before I turn to the next economic update, I want to remind you that we maintain 2 websites that are available all the time, 24/7 at no charge whatsoever, where you can find out about these stories and many more, where our TV interviews and whole courses are offered, again, no charge whatsoever. Please make use of them. That's why we maintain them, to partner with you and make this available, all the work that we do on this program, to you. The first one is rdwolff with 2fs.com, and the second one is democracyatwork.info. Please remember that these are available for you. Make use of them. Through them, you can communicate to us what you like and don't about this program. You can follow us with a click of the mouse on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. These are services for you. Make use of them 24/7, no charge. If you are interested in seeing a video version, a television program in effect, of this program, you can find that on patreon.com. Patreon, patreon.com, for a televised version of this same program. Okay, let's turn back. The International Labor Organization, a product of the United Nations that's been around now since that time after World War II, together with the Walk Free Foundation and the International Organization for Migration, has just completed a study in September of this year of slavery in the world. It was the response to discoveries by news and other organizations that there are plenty of examples of slavery in the world today, long after the world thought it had abolished this system in the world. And so they've released studies. This year's studies were released during the United Nations General Assembly back in September, and they show that 40 million people around the world are victims of modern slavery in the year 2016. They also added, because they thought people would be interested, the estimate that approximately 152 million children aged between 5 and 17 years of age were subject to child labor. This is extraordinary in this day and age, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about it. The new estimates show that women and girls are disproportionately affected by modern slavery, accounting for almost 29 million, or 71% of the overall total of slaves. Women represent 99% of the victims of forced labor in the commercial sex industry, and 84% of forced marriages. Indeed, sex work and forced marriages are the form that slavery takes more than any other single thing. Child labor remains concentrated, primarily in agriculture, 71%. 1 in 5 child laborers work in the service sector, and 12% of child laborers work in industry. A number of companies were identified in recent news reports as using slavery, often called by other names. And one of them struck me because of American history, the phrase indentured immigrant, indentured servant. This is an old thing that was very important in the colonial history of the United States. A person who wanted to leave Europe and come to the United States but lacked the money to pay for the cost of the trip would engage in the following. In exchange for getting the money or a ticket to travel on a boat to come to the Western Hemisphere, they would agree to work for 7 years typically for an employer, the person who fronted the money to pay for the ticket. In the course of working for 7 years, effectively as a slave, you could not escape from this contract. You were effectively forced to work off many times the cost of that ticket. It was a rip-off akin to and close enough to slavery to be included. Well, it turns out that, for example, the Thai food giant CP Foods, which is a major producer and deliverer of prawns and shrimps around the world, was identified by the Guardian newspaper in England as having been a primary supplier to, among other companies, Walmart. So if you think you're not touched by slavery in the world today, think again next time you eat that shrimp cocktail. It is something that we have a world in which we see a variety of problems that we claim to be addressing. But this one remains far below the radar unless and until it's talked about publicly and openly, which is the point and purpose of what I have brought to your attention this morning and this afternoon, depending on when you hear or see this program. The next update has to do with an enormous issue, which deserves much more time than what I can give to it at this particular moment. But I wanted to bring to your attention a story in the Financial Times, a major global economic newspaper that I use quite often. And this recent story was about the so-called gig economy. This lovely phrase that makes it sound almost exciting, this new way of arranging work contracts, where instead of coming to work 9 to 5 every week, under a contract for a year of your labor or several years of your labor, where you know what you're going to be doing and you know when it's going to be and you know the conditions, and that's been agreed to by you or your union on the one hand and the employer on the other. Instead of all that, we have work that is temporary, work that is precarious, work that is maybe there or maybe not. Maybe 2 hours today and 6 tomorrow, and maybe 3 on Saturday, but maybe not. Maybe Friday will tell you we don't need you on Saturday, but you need you on Sunday, all of the rest. And of course, major players in this gig economy are things like Uber and Deliveroo and many of these other companies that specialize in an arrangement that does what? Well, it does many things, but the one I want to focus on today is in a way a very old issue. It turns out that Uber drivers and Deliveroo workers and many others in the so-called gig economy are spending many, many hours working, way beyond the 8-hour day that generations of workers in the history of capitalism fought for. The limit to the working day, because of the intrinsic way in which capitalists, competing with one another, see the profit in getting workers to work another half hour, in getting the length of the lunch break to be reduced, in getting the number of breaks to go to the bathroom to be limited. In other words, to lengthen the working day. For those of you who don't remember, back in the 18th and 19th centuries, the early centuries of capitalism, the length of the working day for most people was 16 hours. It was a fight to get it to 14, then to 12. The history of England is inseparable from what was there called the struggle for the 10-hour day. And here in our own country, the struggle was for the 8-hour day. And we've never gotten beyond that. We have, even now in the United States, on the books, a law that says it's an 8-hour day, and if you require a worker to stay longer, A, it has to be voluntary, and B, you have to pay the worker time and a half. You have to pay more for more than 8 hours, because 8 hours was what? It was assumed to be minimally healthy for a human being. Physically healthy, psychologically healthy, not to be made to work immense long hours of the day. An early joke in British capitalism back in the 18th century was that in Britain, with the new capitalism that was taking over, the beds never get warm. You know what that meant? It meant that the exhausted worker coming home after 14 to 16 hours of labor fell into the bed that was previously occupied by another member of the family who was leaving to go do that kind of a shift of work. My point is, it was a struggle for 100 to 200 years under capitalism to limit the length of the working day. What the gig economy does is to undo those limits. Under the heading of everybody should be free to do all of this language. By the way, the old language of capitalists was, you shouldn't limit our working day, because what we as capitalists do is the efficient way to organize things, and it'll hurt our profits, and that will hurt our ability to offer jobs. You get the old picture. It's really the same stuff recycled all over again. Well, that was ignored by the mass of people. After years of suffering back-breaking labor for an unbelievable number of hours, we fought as a nation for the laws that now exist, limiting us to an 8-hour day. What the gig economy does is give capitalists a new way to go backwards historically, to once again see people working 10, 12, 14, 16 hours a day in order to make a living under the conditions being provided. The basic message: the gig economy is an attempt to get around the limits of an 8-hour working day without having to pay the price or even to face the music that's what you're doing. Fancy words, fancy words. It reminds me of a few years ago when Americans, beginning to feel the pinch of a declining capitalist economy, found it harder and harder to afford hamburger meat. And so capitalism introduced us to hamburger helper, grain, what poor people around the world eat. But we were going to consider it the helper to the now absent hamburger. And we're supposed to feel somehow compensated. We've come to the end of the first half of Economic Update. I hope you found these discussions interesting. Please stay with us. We will be right back after a very short musical interruption.